While Caesar was besieged in Alexandria, he moved through Asia, calming his rebellious legions, while in Africa, the Pompeians were gathering their forces. Many aristocrats, whom Caesar had released after his victory at Pharsalus, including Cato and Scipio, along with the Numidian king Juba, were assembling their army. This situation was far from ideal for Caesar. As long as Pompey's followers continued their resistance, the civil war, which had already greatly strained society and his army, dragged on. Moreover, the African provinces were the main source of grain for the capital, and as long as they remained under enemy control, the Romans faced supply issues, which in turn increased citizen discontent and diminished the prestige of the dictator Caesar himself. In December of 47 BC, Caesar launched a campaign against the Pompeians in Africa. He crossed over to Sicily and began gathering forces for the invasion. The weather was completely unfavorable for navigation, with winter storms raging at sea. Despite the delay caused by the weather, Caesar's forces continued to grow. Gradually, he assembled 6 legions for the invasion of Africa, although 5 of them were made up of recruits. In addition to the infantry, about 2,000 cavalrymen were gathered in Sicily. Overall, Caesar planned to transport an army of 10 legions to Africa. These were substantial forces, yet still smaller than those the Pompeians had already managed to assemble. According to intelligence reports, the Pompeians had 14 legions in their army, not counting a considerable number of Numidian cavalry and lightly armed infantrymen. And the recruitment of troops in Africa continued. Therefore, Caesar was eager to cross the Tunis Strait as swiftly as possible. Finally, on December 25, 47 BC, the weather cleared. Caesar quickly gathered his troops, boarded them onto ships, and set sail for Africa. Unfortunately, a storm broke out at sea, scattering the entire invasion fleet along the African coast. It wasn't until the 4th day of sailing that Caesar managed to land with part of his forces near the city of Hadrumetum. At that point, Caesar had just over 3,000 infantrymen and 150 cavalrymen. He didn't know where the rest of his troops were, and even more concerning was that he hadn't set a rendezvous point in case anyone got left behind or lost. As a result, the ships scattered along the coast had no instructions on where to regroup with their leader. At that time, a Pompeian garrison of 9,000 men was stationed in Hadrumetum. Caesar decided not to attack the city but to secure a defensible position instead. He quickly set up camp near the city, right on the seashore. Neither on that day nor the next did reinforcements arrive, and to make matters worse, scouts reported the approach of a substantial contingent of Numidian cavalry. With his forces pressed against the sea and outnumbered by the enemy, Caesar found himself unable to withstand a potential large-scale assault from the combined forces of the Hadrumetum garrison and the Numidian cavalry. Consequently, he resolved to retreat. Without delay, Caesar broke camp and led his army southward with all possible speed. As soon as they left the camp, the Pompeians, along with the advancing Numidians, launched an attack on the Caesarians during their march. Their aim was to force Caesar to engage in battle on open terrain, encircle his infantry with the Numidian cavalry, composed mainly of archers, and gradually annihilate it. However, Caesar foiled their strategy. He deployed several cohorts of veterans to the rear guard, while his cavalry persistently harried the advancing Numidians, forcing them to retreat intermittently. With the horsemen and veterans keeping the enemy at a safe distance, the rest of the army moved swiftly and without pause towards the nearby city of Ruspina. Caesar's modest force narrowly averted disaster, yet his position remained precarious. The following day, after leaving a garrison in Ruspina and instructing the establishment of a camp near the city, he set out with part of his forces towards the city of Leptis. According to scouts, some ships from the storm-scattered fleet had been sighted there. Indeed, in Leptis, Caesar successfully reunited with the main body of his army. Many transports carrying provisions for the entire army were lost, either sunk during the storm or captured by the enemy. The area around Ruspina had already been heavily plundered by the Pompeians, and most of the local men had been recruited into their forces, resulting in a particularly poor harvest that year. Consequently, the issue of provisions and forage became critical. Caesar promptly issued orders to the territories under his control, instructing them to send supplies as swiftly as possible. He even considered boarding ships with part of his army to search for the lost transports. Fortunately, the next day, most of the ships thought to be lost, along with their troops and supplies, arrived at Ruspina and Leptis. Meanwhile, Titus Labienus, once Caesar's most trusted legate during the Gallic War, and now commander of the Pompeian cavalry and light forces, set up camp near the Caesarian encampment. Although he did not plan to attack Caesar directly, he aimed to keep an eye on his troop movements. Scipio, along with the rest of the army and the Numidian king Juba, intended to join him soon. In Utica, Marcus Porcius Cato, overseeing the city, frequently hosted banquets attended by nearly all the Pompeian leaders. At one such gathering, Cato admonished Pompey's son, pointing out that at his age the elder Pompey had already achieved numerous feats, whereas the younger Gnaeus Pompey had accomplished nothing. Stung by this rebuke, the young Pompey assembled a detachment of slaves and freedmen and attempted an attack on Mauretania. However, his small force was easily defeated by the Mauretanian king Bolgud. Despite its apparent insignificance, this battle had a considerable impact on subsequent events. After all the Caesarian troops finally gathered in Ruspina, the urgent issue of securing forage supplies arose. Separate foraging parties were intercepted and destroyed by the ever-present Numidian cavalry. In response, Caesar ordered a large formation to head out for forage collection, consisting of 30 cohorts, 400 cavalrymen, and 550 archers, totaling over 9,000 soldiers. Practically his entire detachment was made up of recruits. When the detachment had moved only a few miles from the camp, scouts reported to Caesar that dense clouds of dust were visible on the horizon, indicating the approach of a large force. Caesar immediately began deploying his troops in an extended line, striving to maximize the front's width. On the flanks, he stationed his small cavalry with explicit orders to prevent encirclement, and in the front of the entire army, he positioned the archers. Soon the adversary appeared, and at first Caesar thought it was an entirely infantry-based army because of how densely packed it was. However, scouts soon reported that the enemy force was mainly cavalry, with a significant number of light infantry. This was Caesar's first encounter with Numidian battle tactics, where cavalry played the central role and the foot soldiers attacked with arrows and javelins, skillfully avoiding close combat. The Pompeian forces were under the command of Titus Labienus. His command included 12,000 lightly armed infantrymen, 8,000 mounted archers, and 1,600 heavy Gallic and Germanic cavalry. As a reserve, a detachment of 1,500 troops followed under the leadership of Petreius. Labienus's army was quite capable of defeating Caesar, not only because of its numerical superiority, but also because the Pompeians were led by commanders as experienced as Caesar himself. Labienus quickly led his forces into an attack. The Numidian cavalry, advancing on the move, easily scattered the Roman archers positioned at the front line. At the same time, the heavy Gallic cavalry attacked the Roman horsemen on the flank, sparking a fierce and bloody skirmish. The Numidian horsemen used their preferred tactic of sudden raids followed by quick retreats, bombarding the Romans with missiles from a safe distance and avoiding direct combat. Labienus's light infantry also unleashed a barrage of spears and arrows on the Roman cohorts. After a brief but intense clash, the heavy cavalry of the Pompeians routed the smaller Caesarian cavalry and hit the flank of the Roman cohorts. With no resistance left, the Numidians quickly moved to the rear of Caesar's army, showering the legionaries with arrows and javelins from all directions. The situation was dire. All attempts by Caesar's supporters to engage in battle using Roman military tactics were futile. Whenever Romans tried to confront Pompey's forces, they would evade combat and retreat, while arrows and javelins rained down on their unprotected flanks. Panic began to spread through Caesar's army. To maintain order and minimize casualties, Caesar ordered his troops to form a square and adopt a circular defense. However, it would be inaccurate to say that the Romans were entirely powerless in this predicament. The adversaries also suffered losses from the spears and javelins hurled by Caesar's men. Titus Labienus himself was struck by a well-aimed javelin and was forced to withdraw from the battlefield. The assault on Caesar's army persisted until evening, with the situation worsening by the hour. Only with the onset of darkness did Caesar attempt a retreat to the fortified camp. By launching simultaneous attacks in multiple directions, he managed to catch the opponent off guard with a sudden surge of activity, temporarily push back the Numidians, and successfully break through the encirclement. After this, Caesar swiftly marched his bloodied but battle-ready army back to camp. However, a cavalry unit of the Pompeians, led by Petreius, attacked Caesar's rearguard, forcing it to stop. Once again, fortune favored Caesar. A skirmish erupted, but the Pompeian commander was quickly wounded, causing his unit to retreat. With both commanders lost and exhausted from the prolonged battle, the Pompeian forces lost control and retreated, allowing Caesar to break through to the camp. A few days after the battle at Ruspina, Scipio joined forces with Labienus and Petreius, bringing nearly all of the optimates' forces, swelling the Pompeian army to over 60,000 warriors. Juba was expected to join them with the Numidian army, but events delayed him as he approached. Offended by Gnaeus Pompey's attack on Mauretania, Bocchus, the brother of the Mauretanian king, assembled an army under the leadership of the Caesarian Cetius and invaded the Pompeian-allied Numidia. The Mauretanians besieged and soon captured the Numidian city of Cirta, along with several other cities. Upon learning this, the Numidian king hastily returned with his entire army, sending only a small cavalry detachment and 30 elephants to the Pompeians. Despite this, Caesar found himself in a challenging situation. His forces were significantly outnumbered, and the enemy's advantage in cavalry was undeniable. He was unfamiliar with the new tactics employed by his opponents, and the army was ill-prepared to face war elephants. Consequently, Caesar decided to bide his time. His troops were busy constructing and enhancing fortifications near Ruspina, while daily training sessions helped them develop strategies to counter the light infantry cavalry detachments. To prepare his army to face elephants, Caesar dispatched a messenger to Italy, and soon several elephants were delivered, allowing the legionaries to train against these formidable creatures. Nonetheless, the situation for the Roman commander was deteriorating. There was a severe shortage of food and experienced soldiers, as nearly all his veterans were still in Sicily. Any attempts to gather forage were thwarted by the ever-present Numidian cavalry. The need for forage was so desperate that the legionaries had to feed their horses with seaweed. Meanwhile, Scipio almost daily positioned his army near the camp, challenging Caesar to battle. However, Caesar ignored these provocations, and by the end of the day, Scipio would lead his troops back to camp. Such maneuvers occurred almost daily. Discontent began to spread among Pompey's forces, with Numidians and Getulians defecting to Caesar every day. This standoff continued for several weeks until finally in January of the 46th year BC, a turning point emerged. Initially, Caesar's naval fleet, commanded by Sallustius Crispus, captured the Kerkenna Islands and discovered substantial grain stores there. Crispus promptly organized the delivery of provisions to Ruspina. Then, long-awaited reinforcements arrived from Sicily, consisting of 2 veteran legions, the 13th and the 14th, along with 800 Gallic cavalrymen, 1,000 slingers and archers, and a large caravan of provisions. With reinforcements from veteran soldiers secured and the food supply issue resolved, Caesar shifted from a defensive stance to an offensive strategy. On January 25th, he led all of his legions out of camp, directing them toward the ridge of hills where the Pompeians had set up their watchposts. Caesar ordered the occupation of this ridge to dislodge the enemy and establish fortifications in its place. Seeing this move, Scipio also mobilized his entire force from the camp and advanced toward Caesar's army, signaling the likelihood of a major battle. Caesar began arranging his forces for combat. However, the battle did not take place that day. Caesar's cavalry executed a strategic encirclement of the enemy's right flank, where Labienus' Numidian cavalry was positioned, managing to get behind them and start their assault. Seeing this, Labienus quickly began to withdraw his units, and in a state of panic, Scipio's legions followed suit, seeking refuge behind the protective ramparts of their camp. Caesar chose not to pursue them, and instead returned his troops to the task of building fortifications. The next day, Caesar advanced again, strategically positioning his army as he gradually approached Scipio's camp. His route also brought him closer to the city of Uzita, where the Pompeians had their main supply depot. Worried about losing these crucial supplies, Scipio quickly moved to defend the city, setting up his forces near the city walls under the cover of siege engines stationed there. Caesar, thinking Scipio was preparing for a full-scale battle, positioned his army opposite Uzita, but held back from advancing further to avoid exposing his troops to fire from the city walls. Thus, the two armies stood facing each other until the end of the day. This standoff continued over the following days, with both armies facing off but neither daring to initiate combat. Caesar was cautious about attacking an enemy fortified by the city's strong walls. Meanwhile, Scipio awaited the arrival of Juba, whom he had called upon immediately after Labienus's cavalry was defeated. By then, the Numidian king had repelled the invading Mauritanians, and leaving his commander Sabura with part of his forces, soon brought his army to Uzita. Juba's forces included 3 legions, 800 heavily armed cavalrymen, numerous light infantry and cavalry, and 30 elephants. The combined strength of the Pompeian forces now totaled 90,000 men. With a significant advantage in cavalry, the Pompeians persistently harassed Caesar's forces. A series of skirmishes broke out between various detachments, each ending with mixed results. Although both sides tried to avoid a decisive battle, serious clashes were a constant occurrence. Meanwhile, 2 more legions, the famous 9th and 10th, joined Caesar's forces. With a sizable contingent of seasoned soldiers, Caesar decided to take the initiative. His troops, using the camp and fortifications on the hills, gradually began to secure the nearest elevations and build redoubts there. Then the legionaries started constructing 2 parallel lines of ramparts, directing them towards the corners of the city of Uzita. Caesar aimed to besiege Uzita, and to prevent the numerous enemy cavalry from disrupting the siege, he erected defensive ramparts against them. Before long, the defensive ramparts advanced so close to the city that the siege engines could reach its walls. Caesar then set up a new field camp and later built platforms for the siege engines. Onagers and scorpions relentlessly bombarded the city with projectiles both day and night. Each day, the adversaries lined up their troops in battle formation, yet neither side dared to make the first move. Daily, soldiers from both armies dug new trenches and erected additional defensive ramparts. Each day, Caesar's army was strengthened by new defectors from the Pompeian ranks. Meanwhile, the supply and reinforcement routes for the Caesarians were under serious threat. Varus, commanding his naval fleet from Hadrumetum, launched aggressive attacks on the ships. He targeted merchant vessels docked in the harbor of Leptis, sinking many and setting fire to those he couldn't sink. In response, Caesar took it upon himself to tackle this urgent issue. Leading the remnants of his fleet, he launched a surprise attack on Varus's fleet near Hadrumetum. The assault was so unexpected that most of the enemy ships couldn't retreat to the safety of the harbor and were consequently set ablaze by Caesar. Following this victory, Caesar ordered the majority of his fleet to blockade the enemy ships in the harbors of Hadrumetum and Thapsus. As the standoff continued, the Pompeians showed no urgency in withdrawing their troops from Uzita or engaging in a decisive battle. Meanwhile, the situation regarding provisions and forage for Caesar's army worsened. Consequently, Caesar decided to lift the siege of Uzita and set out with his forces in search of new food sources. Under the cover of night, he ordered the camp to be dismantled and burned, and then marched towards the city of Agar, with Scipio in pursuit. Along the way, Caesar encountered little resistance and managed to capture several cities under Pompeian control, including Zeta and Sarsura. Although the Pompeian army trailed him, its larger size made it less mobile, preventing it from keeping pace with Caesar. Only Labienus, leading the Numidian cavalry, persistently harassed Caesar with raids, hindering his efforts to gather forage. Soon, several thousand seasoned veteran legionaries joined Caesar, having previously been unable to arrive with their units due to illness or leave. With their arrival, Caesar finally deemed the time ripe for a decisive battle. He resolved to lay siege to the strategically vital city of Thapsus, a stronghold of great importance to the Pompeians. Caesar anticipated that this siege would compel Scipio and Labienus to come to the city's aid. On April 4th, 46 BC, Caesar's forces reached the walls of Thapsus, which was already under blockade by the Caesarians from the sea. Thapsus could be approached by two routes. From the south, where a narrow strip of land lay between the coastline and expansive marshes, or from the northwest. Upon approaching the city and initiating the siege, Caesar immediately commanded the construction of extensive defensive works. The southern passage was fortified with a system of ramparts, trenches, and redoubts. Around the city, two lines of fortifications began to rise. As with the siege of Alesia, one line faced inward against the besieged city to thwart any sorties by the garrison, while the other faced outward to defend against the enemy forces attempting to relieve Thapsus. Between these lines, Caesar established a military camp. Caesar came up with a plan to block the Pompeians' southern route, forcing them to attack from the northwest on a relatively narrow strip of land. This restricted area made it difficult for the Numidian cavalry to be effective, creating a challenge for the legionaries. Scipio planned to advance from the south, but encountered the defensive structures of the Caesarians. Reluctant to attack the fortifications, he moved his army northward, skirting the marsh. His goal was to overpower Caesar with sheer numbers and prevent his escape to the south. To accomplish this, he placed his most mobile units, the cavalry under Labienus, in ambush. After getting around the marsh, Scipio didn't waste any time. As soon as he set up camp, he arranged his troops for battle. This decision worked in Caesar's favor, as the Pompeian soldiers were already tired from their long march and fortification efforts. Caesar quickly deployed his army, lining them up for combat as well. The battle took place on the same day, April 6th, 46 BC. Caesar commanded 10 legions, totaling about 50,000 men, including 5,000 cavalry. On the right flank, he placed two veteran legions, the 2nd and the 10th, while the 8th and the 10th, also seasoned, formed the left flank. The remaining troops, a mix of veterans and recruits, made up the center. The forces were arranged in 3 lines. Caesar strategically split the 5th Legion into 2 parts, positioning them on the flanks to protect the rear from enemy cavalry attacks. Cavalry, light infantry, archers, and slingers were also stationed on the flanks. He left part of his army, 2 legions of recruits, as a garrison for the camp fortifications, anticipating a potential sortie from Thapsus. Scipio commanded around 72,000 warriors, including 14,000 cavalry and 60 elephants. His infantry was similarly arranged in 3 lines, with archers and cavalry on the flanks, and elephants positioned at the front of the flanks, intended as the primary striking force. The armies faced each other, yet for a while, neither Scipio nor Caesar dared to give the order to engage. During this standoff, Caesar's veterans noticed an unusual commotion in the rear flanks of Pompey's forces. They urged Caesar to signal the attack, seeing the enemy as hesitant and seemingly intimidated. However, Caesar was reluctant to start the battle. It was then that the veterans of the 10th Legion compelled their trumpeters to sound the attack signal, taking the initiative to advance. The rest of the troops followed the veterans on the right flank. Realizing he could no longer contain his soldiers' fervor, Caesar finally ordered the attack and joined the charge himself. The archers on Caesar's right flank unleashed a torrent of arrows and javelins at the elephants, while trumpets blared and soldiers fiercely shouted, clashing their swords against their shields. Although the elephants were trained to endure projectiles, they weren't used to such loud and piercing sounds. The elephants on the right flank, unnerved by the wailing Roman trumpets and the general uproar of Caesar's advancing forces, couldn't withstand the overwhelming barrage and terrifying noises. They turned back, causing chaos within the battle formations of the Pompeians themselves. Consequently, Caesar's right wing overwhelmed the left wing of Scipio's army and breached the camp. At the same time, on Caesar's left flank, the elephants showed greater resilience. They broke through the ranks of Caesar's archers and cavalry, engaging with the cohorts of the 5th Legion. The seasoned veterans of the 5th Legion withstood the elephants' assault and used all of their training against these formidable beasts. They targeted the animals' vulnerable spots, bombarded them with spears and arrows, and sounded their horns. Before long, the elephants, unable to endure the onslaught, turned back and, driven by fear and pain, wreaked havoc on Scipio's formations. The resistance of the Pompeians crumbled across the entire front, leading to the rout of Scipio's army. Amidst the battle's intensity, the garrison of Thapsus attempted a sortie to strike Caesar from behind. However, 2 of Caesar's legions, stationed for defense, easily repelled the attack. The commanders of Pompey's forces, along with the remnants of their troops, turned and fled. The defeat of Pompey's forces was total. Various reports suggest that between 10 and 50,000 of Pompey's men were killed, while Caesar's losses ranged from 1 to 2,000 soldiers. Many commanders from Scipio's army fled the battlefield. Lucius Afranius retreated to Numidia, but Citius, who had already defeated Sabura, intercepted his detachment, captured Afranius, and soon executed him. Labienus, Varus, and Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus managed to escape to Spain, where they quickly began gathering troops to continue the war. Petreius and Juba returned to Numidia, only to find all of the city gates shut against them by the king's own subjects, who had heard of their defeat. For a while, Petreius and Juba wandered the countryside, but in utter despair, they decided to die as warriors. They engaged in a sword fight, where Petreius defeated the former king, and then ordered a slave to end his life with a sword. Scipio tried to escape to Spain, but his ship was intercepted by Caesar's fleet. To avoid capture, Scipio chose to take his own life. After his victory, Caesar faced no resistance as he occupied Uzita and Hadrumetum, and then moved on to Utica. The city's commander Cato was preparing for a prolonged siege, but the citizens did not share his determination. As a result, Cato disbanded his troops and helped the Romans fleeing from Caesar until the very end. Upon seeing Caesar's standards on the horizon, Cato took his own life. Caesar stayed in Utica until a delegation from Numidian Zama arrived, inviting him to take control of Juba's former kingdom. Caesar accepted the offer and incorporated this vast territory into the Roman domain. Africa had been subdued, but it was too soon to relax, as the Civil War was far from over. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.